Julian sat in the quiet pew for a long time, simply breathing in the peace of the church. The old familiar anger and bitterness felt like a story about someone else, a heavy coat he had finally taken off and left behind. He didn't need to say anything else. The thank you had been enough. When he finally stood to leave, his knees cracked, a reminder of his age. But he felt lighter, younger than he had in a decade. He walked out into the evening, the streetlights now casting a soft glow. He patted his shirt pocket, feeling the outline of the small wooden rosary. It was his anchor. The next morning, true to his promise, he stopped at the small market and bought a single vibrant red geranium in a simple clay pot. He placed it carefully in the once neglected planter by his front door. It was a small spot of defiant, joyful color against the dull brick. At school, the new rhythm continued. He greeted his students by name. He learned that Peter's father had left, and that's why no one helped him with his homework. He learned that Maria's mother was sick. He stopped being just a teacher of math and started being a listener, a steady presence. The children, in turn, began to trust him. The classroom was no longer a place of dread, but a place of quiet order and occasionally discovery. He never put Lucia on the spot again. Their communication was a series of small, silent understandings. A nod in the hallway, a shared glance when a struggling student finally grasped a concept. She was his quiet reminder. One Friday afternoon, weeks later, Julian was erasing the board after class. Most of the children had rushed out, eager for the weekend. He heard a soft shuffle behind him. It was Lucia. She walked up to his desk, where the photo of his daughter stood next to a small, now familiar pile of his things. His grade book, a mug, and the wooden rosary he often left there during the day. She didn't say anything. She just looked at the photo, then at the rosary, and then up at him. Her serene eyes held a question. "Would you like to hold it?" Julian asked softly, understanding her look. She nodded. He picked up the rosary and gently placed it in her small, open hands. She closed her fingers around it, her touch reverent. "She would have liked you," Julian said, his voice thick with an emotion that was no longer painful. He was looking at the photo. "My daughter. She loved puzzles. She would have liked how you see the numbers." Lucia looked from the rosary in her hands to the man before her, his face softened by a grief that had finally found peace. "She knows," Lucia said, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a mystical declaration. It was a simple, comforting statement of fact, as real to her as the wooden beads in her hand. She offered the rosary back to him. "You keep it," Julian said, closing her fingers back over it. "I think it was always meant for you. I remember now how to listen. I don't need it to remind me anymore." Lucia looked down at the gift in her hands, then tucked it safely into the pocket of her dress. She gave him one last profound look, a look that seemed far older than her 8 years. And then she turned and walked out of the classroom, her footsteps silent on the worn floor. Julian finished erasing the board. The setting sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He looked at the clean green slate. Monday he would write a new problem, maybe something a little challenging, but beautiful in its logic. He picked up the photo of his daughter, wiping a non-existent speck of dust from the glass. He smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached his eyes. He left the classroom, locking the door behind him. The hallway was empty and quiet. As he walked toward the exit, he passed the chapel. The door was open. This time, he didn't stop or hesitate. He simply made the sign of the cross, a habit from a childhood he thought he'd forgotten, and whispered, "Good night." Outside, the air was cool. He could hear the distant sounds of the city. He walked home, not with a hurried gait, but with a comfortable stride. He noticed his geranium was thriving. He'd need to water it tomorrow. He entered his house. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home again, filled with the memory of love and the quiet promise of peace. He had finally learned the greatest equation of all, that grief plus time, multiplied by love, could eventually equal a kind of healing. And it was a little girl, a simple wooden cross, and the unwavering order of numbers that had helped him solve it. The song was no longer something he had to struggle to hear. It was all around him, and now he was finally singing along. On Christmas Eve, Julian did something he had not done in 15 years. He put on his best suit, now a little tight around the middle, and walked to the parish church for the midnight mass. The church was packed, glowing with candlelight and filled with the sound of familiar hymns that tugged at a deep childhood memory within him. He didn't sit in the back. He found a spot in the middle, amidst the families and the couples. When the time came to offer the sign of peace, he turned to the elderly woman beside him. "Peace be with you," he said, and he meant it. "And also with you," she replied, smiling. He didn't receive communion. He still wasn't ready for that step. But he knelt when others knelt. He stood when they stood, and he listened. The priest spoke of a light shining in the darkness, and how a single small light could pierce the deepest night. Julian thought of a small cross on a simple string, and a light in a little girl's eyes that had refused to let his darkness win. After the Mass, he walked home under a clear, cold sky, full of brilliant stars. His breath fogged in the air. The world was silent and still. When he arrived home, he went to the altar. He lit the candle next to his daughter's photo for the first time. The small flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wall. He didn't say a long prayer. He looked at the photo, then out the window at the starry night. "Thank you for sending her," he said quietly. The flame danced in response. He knew the journey wasn't over. There would still be difficult days. The memory of his daughter would sometimes bring a tear to his eye, but the tear would no longer be one of despair, but of loving remembrance. The song of his life had found a new key, a gentler, more resilient melody, composed of simple things: the trust of a student, the gratitude of a mother, the taste of a Christmas cookie, and the unwavering faith of a child who had heard the music all along. Professor Julian blew out the candle, content in the peaceful darkness, and went to bed, a man finally and fully at home in his own heart. "She is happy," the girl said, with overwhelming simplicity. Julian held his breath. He didn't need to ask who she was. He felt a wave of warmth in his chest, a peace that filled his lungs. "Yes?" he managed to whisper. Lucia nodded. "Yes, because you no longer cry alone. Now you remember her with love, and love is stronger than sadness." It's like she searched for the words, like when the sun comes out after the rain. Before Julian could respond, the girl left the classroom, leaving those words floating in the air, filling every corner of the room. Julian sat down, not to cry, but to savor that truth, so simple and so profound. Love is stronger than sadness. How many sermons had he heard in his life that hadn't reached him like that simple phrase from an 8-year-old girl? The rest of the day passed in a different way. At recess, instead of locking himself in the teacher's lounge, he went out to the playground. He walked among the children. He saw Lucia sitting in her corner, but no longer alone. Another girl, drawn perhaps by the calm she radiated, had sat down next to her and was showing her some little figures. Lucia was smiling, looking at them with interest. Julian smiled too. It was a small miracle, a new beginning. At the end of the day, he did not feel the bittersweet relief of escaping that place. He gathered his things calmly. Before leaving, he stopped in front of the chapel. The door was still ajar. This time, he hesitated only for a moment. He pushed the door gently and entered. The interior was small and simple. A few wooden pews, an altar with a crucified Christ, and the smell of wax and peace. There was no one there. He stood at the end of the center aisle, feeling a little out of place, like an intruder in someone else's house. He didn't kneel. He didn't pray a formal prayer. He simply stood there in silence. He looked at the suffering face of the image of Christ, and for the first time, he did not see a symbol of a God who allows pain, but someone who had also suffered an immense loss and had transformed it into love. "Thank you," he murmured into the silence. It was the only word that came from his heart. "Thank you for my daughter's life. Thank you for the love she gave me. And thank you for sending a little messenger to remind me." Nothing spectacular happened. No ray of light fell from the ceiling, but a deep warmth, like a gentle embrace, enveloped his heart. He felt an enormous weight he had carried for years, of which he wasn't even aware, lift from his shoulders. He left the chapel feeling lighter, renewed. The afternoon sun welcomed him warmly. At the gate, Lucia's mother was talking to another lady. Seeing him, she smiled. "Good afternoon, Professor," she greeted. "Good afternoon, ma'am," replied Julian, stopping. "How are you?" Well, Lucia tells me she had a very nice class today." Julian looked at the girl who was playing with the bars of the gate. "It was she who gave the most important lesson to all of us," he said sincerely. Lucia's mother looked at him curiously, but just nodded, as if she understood more than she let on. "She is special. She always has been. She says she sometimes dreams of numbers and angels." She said it with naturalness, as if talking about the weather. Julian nodded. It no longer seemed strange to him. It seemed wonderful. "Take good care of her," he said, and his voice sounded a bit hoarse with emotion. "She is a treasure." "I know," replied the mother, and in her eyes there was a mix of pride and a subtle worry, that of someone who guards something very valuable. "And to you, Professor, may God bless you." "Likewise," muttered Julian. Lucia then approached, and without saying anything, took her mother's hand to leave. But before turning away, she extended her other little hand toward the professor, not to shake his hand, but with her palm open. On it rested a small rosary bead, made of wood, like her cross, worn down from so much use. "It's for you," she said simply, "so you don't feel alone." Julian held back a tear. He extended his hand, and the girl placed the small object in his palm. The wood was warm from contact with her skin. "I don't know how to thank you, Lucia." "There's no need to thank," she replied. "You just have to remember that he is always here." And with that, she turned and left, gently pulling her mother's hand. Julian closed his hand around the rosary. He felt it solid, real, against his skin. It wasn't just any gift. It was an anchor, a tangible reminder that faith is not believing that God will avoid all storms, but trusting that He will be with us in the midst of them. He walked towards his house, with the rosary tightly held in his pants pocket, and he knew, with a certainty that filled his soul, that the song that Lucia had helped him hear again would not go silent again. He would carry it with him, like a background melody that would remind him every day that love is always stronger. The song at last sounded complete in his heart. Julian closed his hand around the rosary, feeling the rough, warm texture of the wood against his palm. It wasn't a valuable object, but to him it was a treasure more valuable than anything he had owned in years. He carefully put it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. The walk home that afternoon was different from all the previous ones. He didn't walk with his head down, sunk in his pit of loneliness. He walked with a new peace, as if he carried a wonderful secret hidden in his chest. He noticed the world in a different way, the greeting of the street sweeper, the smell of freshly baked bread from the bakery on the corner, the children playing ball in a square. They were no longer just things happening around his pain, but part of life, of that song he had begun to hear again. When he got home, he didn't go straight in. He stopped at the small planter by the door, where some weeds were struggling to survive. Since his daughter died, he had neglected everything, starting with himself. With a care he had forgotten, he pulled out some dry weeds and promised himself that the next day he would bring a small plant, something that deserved to live. Inside, the house was the same, but he was not. The silence was no longer empty, it was peaceful. He took off his jacket and before doing anything else, took the rosary out of his pocket. He placed it reverently next to his daughter's photo on the altar he had cleaned. The two objects together, his little girl's smile and Lucia's simple faith, seemed perfect to him. That night, for the first time in over a decade, he sat in his old armchair and did not turn on the television to drown out his thoughts. He sat in silence, looking out the window at the sky turning orange and then purple. He took out the rosary. He didn't use it to pray the full rosary. He didn't quite remember how. He simply passed the beads through his fingers, one by one, as if each one were a grain of peace integrating into him. With each bead, he remembered a happy moment with his daughter, her first step, the first time she said "Daddy," the day she won the race at school. The memories no longer hurt, they comforted him. The next day at school, something had changed in the atmosphere. The children, who are always sensitive to the energies of adults, felt Professor Julian's calmness. Math class was different. He didn't fill the board with complicated operations. He gave them a simple problem, but asked them to think not only about the answer, but about the beauty of it always being the same. Peter, the boy who always sought to mock, raised his hand. "Professor, why is that important?" Julian smiled. "Because it tells us that there is an order in the universe, Peter, and that we can trust that order, just as we can trust that the sun will rise every morning, even if it is sometimes cloudy." Lucia, from her desk, nodded softly, with a small smile of approval. She was like the sun behind the clouds for Julian. Even if she wasn't always visible, he knew she was there, giving light. The days turned into weeks. Julian did not become a completely different man overnight. He still had his moments of sadness, his gray mornings. Melancholy was an old visitor that sometimes still knocked on his door. But the difference was enormous. Now, when sadness arrived, he didn't lock himself away with it in the dark. He turned on a light. He took out the rosary. He looked at his daughter's photo and talked to her, told her about his day. Sometimes he went for a walk, breathing the fresh air until the weight in his chest eased. He began to notice his students more. Peter, the mocker, struggled with math because no one at home helped him. Julian started staying 10 minutes after class to explain things to him patiently. He encouraged Maria, who was always sad, to draw the problems instead of solving them with numbers. He discovered that each child had their own song, and his job was no longer to impose the score, but to help them find their melody. One afternoon, leaving school, he saw Lucia and her mother waiting for the bus. He approached them. "Hello." He greeted them naturally. "Hello, Professor," replied the mother. "Lucia tells me she is very happy in class." "I am very happy to have her," said Julian, and looked at the girl. "How are you, Lucia?" "Fine," she replied with her usual simplicity. "And you? Do you hear the song better now?" Julian smiled, a broad, genuine smile that wrinkled his eyes. "I hear it a little clearer every day," he confessed. "Thanks to you." The bus arrived at that moment. Lucia's mother got on, but the girl lingered for a moment. She looked at the professor with her serene eyes. "She hears it too," she said quietly, "and she sings along." She didn't specify who she was. It wasn't necessary. Julian nodded, his heart filled with a peace so great it almost hurt. It was so sweet. "Take care, Lucia." "You too, Professor." And the girl got on the bus, which started up and carried away its little messenger. Julian stood at the stop, watching the bus move away until it became a dot on the horizon. The world around him buzzed. Cars, people going home, the bustle of normal life. But inside him, there was an unshakable calm. He knew then that his life would not be one of big, spectacular miracles. It would be one of small, everyday miracles. The peace of a sunset, the smile of a student who finally understands, the comfort of a happy memory, the feel of a wooden rosary in his pocket. And that was more than enough. It was everything. He began to walk towards his house, but detoured. Instead of taking the direct path, he entered the neighborhood church. It wasn't the small school chapel, but the large parish church. It was half empty. A few elderly people were praying in the pews. The smell of incense was soft. He didn't go to the front. He sat on a bench at the back. He didn't pray with elaborate words. He simply took off his hat, bowed his head, and whispered from the depths of his soul, "Thank you for everything." And for the first time, in a very, very long time, Professor Julian felt that his gratitude was heard, not by a distant and remote God, but by a father who had always been there, waiting for him in silence until an 8-year-old girl reached out her hand to guide him back home. The song at last sounded complete in his heart.